welcome to a new series we're calling Conversations With. My name is Shaley Hoogendoorn, and I live with bipolar 2 disorder.
And my name is Julie Kraft, and I am also living with bipolar 2 disorder.
Julie and I believe in the power of storytelling. We know that sharing with others is healing, both individually and collectively.
There are so many different experiences.
So we wanted to share more stories of bipolar with you and interview others.
Our stories are powerful. They can become a source of strength and hope and inspiration.
Our voices need to be heard. Our stories aren't over yet. This is bipolar. Hi everyone, welcome back to This is Bipolar, our Conversations With series, and I'm so pumped because I have Diehl here, and I was on Jared's podcast a while ago. It's called Louder Now, go check it out. And we just had a really great time, and I'm super pumped because Jared, you're the first dude on our
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. That's a whole conversation in and of itself, probably.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I'm like, on my podcast, I've had mostly women, so I'm like,
Yes, right?
what's going on? But
let's talk about that. I love that. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Jared?
Oh man. Well, first of all, it's so awesome to be with you. I had such a great time when we did you were on the Louder Now podcast back in like a few months ago. So first of all, just thanks for having me. Yeah, my name's Jared. I am almost 36 in a couple of months. Not November 13th, which is crazy. 36. I live in Southern California, Los Angeles County. Yeah, I mean, we'll get into my bipolar stuff, but yeah, I've been like diagnosed since about 2007. So almost half my life, really. And I love hockey. I don't play as much as I used to, but I grew up in Minnesota and Colorado, like ice skating. So anything skating, hockey, it was very privileged to play as a kid because it was, expensive and got to travel, got to see all over Colorado. And I really just like to play even more than watching. But and I love movies and shows and like all things creative. I also do a lot of poetry, and that's actually something that's kind of come out of a lot of my struggles. Is like I've always been kind of a writer, but then when I started having panic attacks and episodes, I kind of just started writing poetry as a way of I don't know. I'm sure other people can relate to that, where you use it as kind of a tool to process the chaos, and you're like, oh, why am I writing poems? This is weird.
I love that. I haven't seen any of your
a few things about me. Yeah. So
that's awesome. Wow. Yeah, you need to send me some. Do you post them on
Instagram? I do. Yeah, I have a WordPress like blog, and
oh my goodness,
for sure I'll send it to you. Yeah, you can put the link in the notes or two.
Yeah,
it's just like jareddiehl.com, and it's probably about 80% of it is probably about girls, and then 20% is about everything else.
Yeah, as it is, right?
Old relate. You're like, oh wow, I'm still writing about that person.
Yeah, we feel things deeply.
But yeah, I've always been very intuitive, and I guess more right-brained, and more like I loved acting, and I think that's why I love shows and movies. It's like, oh, I'm very sensitive, actually, is what it is. And sometimes you want to turn that off because you're like, oh, I don't like that. I need to be tough, and I'm like, well, that's part of the problem, is that if you just deny your, so tenderness and compassion and empathy, I think, come naturally to me, honestly. Maybe that's like a weird thing to say.
That is such a weird thing. I love that.
Yeah.
It's fighting the toxic masculinity, right? Or the stigma that we need to be stronger, or we wouldn't be sensitive. But I think, I don't know, I think we point to the hard things in the world. And I think I try and think of it as my superpower, because we're aware, right? We're aware of things that people are stuffing down, but that can also be hard and exhausting too, right?
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
I love that. I love that you know that about yourself. And I think that that's awesome. Maybe that's why I like you so much. I think.
Oh man, I like you too. You're great.
Awesome. Well, I would love to just start. I know like tidbits of your story, but I would
Sure.
just like to start, from the beginning when maybe you realized something was wrong, or maybe you didn't and others did around you. When did that kind of happen? And tell me about it.
Yeah, for sure. Great question. Well, I think for everybody, I mean, things go back to childhood, right? It goes back to like, wow, what was it like as a kid? What were you like as a kid? I have one older sister. My parents were, my dad was not a good relationship with him. He was
Mm,
really not a great dad, honestly.
mm,
Um, and he was kind of undiagnosed bipolar, but he
yeah.
never got any help. He yelled, he used alcohol. He was a good dad, and like, we played hockey together and he was there
Mhm.
for me for that. But I think you just kind of remember the negative stuff more. So I'm like, oh, you yelled a lot too, right? You were verbally abusive. And then my mom was like the opposite. She was like the perfect, loving
Mhm.
mom.
Yeah,
Not perfect, but just
I
was
know
like,
what you
she
mean.
kind of held everything together. And she was a flight attendant as a job. She just retired recently, but pretty much our whole lives she traveled. So you have kids, right? Having little kids and doing that is not a good combination,
Yeah,
so
that's right.
we kind of like the sensitive creative me. I think I did have a lot of symptoms of definitely lots of anxiety, definitely lots of like being kind of in my head a lot. And I think a lot of it, when I look back at it, was some of it was like a gift, right? Like I loved to be on stage. I loved attention from people. And I
Mhm.
think some of it was maybe coming from a place of pain too, where I felt
Right.
kind of rejected at home. And
Yeah.
then I kind of gravitated towards like, oh, people like me. And I did horrible in school, like grades wise.
Mm.
I don't know
Okay.
how I got through school,
Oh,
but I just socially I was awesome. So I used my, like, everybody loves me. I was like student council, and my sister was the same way. We both had similar personalities, similar struggles. I played hockey. Religion was a huge part of my life. We went to church all the time. So I definitely had moments where, like, you could have said, man, are you depressed? Or like, when I really got down, I really, really felt it deep. But I never had any, like, I got kicked out of class for being, maybe it was like ADHD was part of what I had too.
yeah.
um but I didn't have an episode until I was like 20, almost 22. I was in college. So to kind of answer the question of like when, so yeah, signs as a kid, but then yeah, I
Yeah.
had a panic attack one night. And I had been on, this is crazy, but I like try not to use the word crazy too much.
Oh,
But
it's
like
so hard,
I
right?
I did, I went to like a ministry place in Kansas City where there was like this 24-hour kind of worship uh environment thing. It was really awesome in a lot of ways. It was also strange too.
Yeah.
And I decided to like stay up all night. So they had like a night watch is what they called it. So
Yeah.
I would go to sleep at 7 a.m. and then get up at like
Yeah.
3. And
Right.
then in the fall it gets dark at like 4:30.
Mm.
So I would like barely see the sun, and I did that for 3 years, like
What?
without stopping. Yeah, so from 18. And um so I went to like they had a school, and so at first it started out as like an internship, and it was like, why are you choosing to stay up all night? And so I think my parents were concerned about that, but they kind of were like, well, it's like your decision if you want to do that. I don't think anybody was thinking, oh, maybe you're gonna have an episode. No one thought that,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
so and there was a little bit of a warning from kind of the people at this place, like, hey, just so you know, you're probably going to feel kind of these 10 things all the time. You're going to feel tired a lot, and this is not normal. So I was really just this, like, spiritually it was great, the community was great. But yeah, I definitely crashed and burned and hit a wall, and I definitely think it like spun me into an episode.
Mm.
So yeah, I had a panic attack one night, which I'm sure some people are familiar with that. If you're not, it was really like mind racing panic, and then I couldn't sleep. So, I didn't sleep for like a day, but then it was like, wow, my mind just went to this real like negative place. pretty quick. And then, I'm calling home. So I stayed in Kansas City for like 7 days and I didn't sleep at all.
Oh,
And I was like freaking out and, probably had some suicidal thoughts too, because it's just like you're not, after like 3 days, you're
yeah.
you're you're like hallucinating kind of thing. So
Mhm.
my mom put me on a flight. I went home to California. Yeah, I saw a doctor. The word bipolar was really never suggested at all.
Right.
My sister, who's like 3 years older, had similar things in college, but she didn't go through what I went through. She had more of kind of like a ADD like
Yeah.
thing or
Yeah. It's
whatever. And
hard because they overlap sometimes, right?
for sure. And I definitely think I've had a lot of symptoms of that. So anyway, long story short, I get on medicine and then I eventually sleep. I mean, I felt like I slept after about a month. So it was like a month of chaos. Like, yeah. And I'm just, I'm in like beautiful Orange County, like by the beach, going to the ocean every day. And I'm like feeling horrible about life.
Yeah.
So you're like, isn't everybody in Orange County happy? No, just kidding. Probably not. But
That's deep.
uh, no, you would think you're like, well, you're in like paradise, right? But you're feeling horrible. So anyway, I kind of just snapped out of it after about 6 months, and nobody was really accepting the bipolar thing. Like, I thought it was really just some kind of spiritual attack, right? Like some spiritual battle, which is a very Christian thing
Yeah.
to do, or if you're religious, you definitely try to be like, is this the devil? And let's
Mm.
pray. And obviously, God's involved, and I'm sure there was spiritual forces involved, but it was also like something was not good in my body. So
Yeah.
I snapped out of it and I went right back to my life, almost as if it never happened.
Really?
Really weird.
Like
Yeah,
you woke up one day and it just felt
yeah,
different?
well, I was in California. I was drinking a lot because I was
Mm.
trying to sleep.
Right.
And I was like working at a grocery store. And I was like, I'm supposed to be finishing school. Um, all I'm doing is feeling bad about myself. So this was the one time where I snapped out of it by like a thought that I had. It's the only time this ever happened. Like,
Yeah.
when people are like, oh, just, like think a positive thought, like, and
You're
move,
like, right. I never
right,
thought of
like
that.
just let go, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are you obsessing? Just let go. And you're like, oh, is it really as easy as like putting your foot down and being like, no, I'm moving on. So
Yeah.
I do think that can happen. So this was a moment where
Yeah.
it was a thought thing. It wasn't anything else. And God was probably involved too. I literally I was sitting in my room and I was like, F this. This is
Yeah.
like, all I'm doing is feeling bad for myself.
Yeah.
Like, what's so bad about my life? Like, cool, I had 6 months where I didn't sleep and, I missed school. I feel like I'm letting people down. So
Mhm.
I literally just was like, I better start being grateful. It was just this thing. And I went to the grocery store. I cashed the last check that they got. I was supposed to go to work. I didn't even go to work. I went in to get paid and I was like, see you guys. I called a cab. This is 2007, or 8. So it was like, before Uber. I called a cab. I went to the airport. I bought a plane ticket in cash, which probably looks suspicious, right? They're
Yeah.
like, and I literally just flew back to Kansas City and then like, texted my parents and said, hey, see you later. I'm not coming back.
Yeah. Do
And
you
I
think
just,
that that was kind of a hypomanic, manic moment to make such a
yeah, for sure.
decision?
But I did snap out of it. So I
Yeah.
did just go right to like, I had already kind of been off medicine. I think I was taking Ambien and that was it. It was prescribed from like a family physician. And so I snapped out of it. But then, yeah, a year later, the same exact thing happened in the fall, October, November, around my birthday, and so then it happened again. And so the second time around, I was a little bit more like, oh, okay, I think I got lucky last time and I just kind of was able to snap out of it. But now this seems to be like a problem, right? And so I was actually a lot less freaked out. I was like, oh, I'm not sleeping, but I was actually less worried.
Yeah, you're like, this is familiar. Did it
Yeah,
happen? I know for me,
yeah.
it's very cyclical. Did it happen like almost overnight? Mine happens where it's like just one day and then the next not, and mine is a fall to like fall.
Yeah, kind of. Well, it was a mixture of, so I had been on that night schedule, and so I got off that
Okay.
schedule. I was still
Yep.
probably staying up late. I started playing hockey again. I got a cool
Yep.
job editing videos for this youth camp. So I was doing all these things, but then there were other triggers. My friend got married, and I moved out of his house, and that was kind
Yep.
of a hard thing because it was like we were bros for like almost 4 years, and then I'm like, oh, I'm happy that you're married, but I'm not, I got to move out of your, your house. So there was other relational
Mm-hmm.
things of just like that I think triggered it, but it was also seemed to be like that time of the year too, where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, the light changes.
Mm-hmm.
So those are triggers too, the fall and the spring, right? Like too
Yep.
much light or like too little light. So yeah, it was similar circumstances where it was like, oh, I think my body's just getting stressed or something, and I wasn't really taking good care of myself, as far as like physically. So it happened the second time around, and then I went back to California and ended up staying, saw a different doctor, and then he was like, oh yeah, man, this is just like you're like a cycle of, it's bipolar, but you're just, he said something like you're cycling, which I didn't know what that meant, like
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But I got on a lot of medication, um, all different stuff than the previous time.
Right.
So this time around, kind of long story short, I ended up being okay for like 3 years, but this doctor um, kind of put me on like a lot of medication. So I didn't realize, I was like, I think I'm on too much stuff.
Right.
And the hard part is like when you look back, you go, oh, I wish I would have, like asked more questions, right? Like my mom was really supportive. She drove me to all these appointments. I didn't have a car too. And she took notes and she wrote things down, and she's
Oh
like, oh,
yeah.
and my parents were going through a divorce too at this time too.
Oh, that's
So that was kind of, yeah, I was living with my mom to kind of help her. Anyway, and I was working at Trader Joe's. No, Trader Joe's is the spot. So it was cool. I mean, I was able to function. That was the thing. I was on a lot of meds, but I was able to hold a job. I
yeah.
made, um, and so anyway, I went back to Kansas City to just because like I missed it. I wasn't like fully ready to be in California, and that was a little rough because I didn't really get like a new doctor. I kept So anyway, what happened was, after about 3 years of all of these meds, I felt like I was going to have an episode again, but I was on medication. So
Mm.
that was really strange. It was like, wait, isn't the episode from not being on meds or
Right.
whatever? I mean, it's complicated. Um, so the mistake was I got mad at the California doctor who was just, every visit he would not really lower anything. He just kept it all
Right.
the same. So I just pretty much fired him. I was like, I don't want you to be my doctor anymore, which
Yep.
is what you should never do, right? Never take things into your own hands. And I
Yeah.
ended up really kind of just listening to like my friends who were around me who were like, yeah, nobody said get off all your meds. People just said maybe you should get off like, one or two of these. You're on like four different things. Maybe that would help. So initially that's what I did. And I did notice a difference right away where I was like, kind of like lighter and like more
Mm.
present with people, like funnier.
Yeah.
And
Did you
then
taper it on your own?
I
Because
did, yeah, I did.
yeah.
And I was taking one specific medication where, they're like, you have to be careful how you get off of this. I even actually looked into going to like a facility, like to get
Wow.
like a detox facility or
Wow.
something. But I was like, oh, I don't, that sounds expensive. Or so I think my mom was concerned for sure. She was like, maybe you should see a doctor there.
Yeah.
So what happened is I ended up pretty much just getting off of almost everything except for like a small amount of one medicine that also kind of helped me with sleep. And that was where like that was, not good that I did that. So after
Yeah.
about a
Yes,
year,
we don't recommend it to
right,
the
never,
listeners.
right. And I tell this story a lot when I do presentations, and I'm like, never do that. Like, don't,
Mm.
it's gonna end up really bad for you.
And
So that's
it's
what,
so tempting, right? Especially like even I've never done it, but I even still have thoughts because I miss parts of mania. I just thought, well, maybe if I lower it, I could feel a little bit of the like I know a lot of people that don't have a mood disorder that just are like, why would you ever go off your meds? And you're like, well, you like parts of it. It isn't always
Right.
terrible.
Well,
Yeah.
it goes both ways. One is obviously for me was I was feeling bad. So I was like,
Yes.
oh, I'm about to have an episode, but I'm on meds. So it would logically make sense to like lower some of those.
Yeah.
And I was right at the beginning. It did help. But then I took it too far and I'm just like, oh, well, what if I just, don't get off like all of it? And it's like your body has literally been on these meds for years.
Yeah.
So for you to mess with that is like so that's what happened. So I had a third episode, same around October, November, but
And this was a depressive episode?
well, same thing. I mind racing, couldn't
Okay.
sleep.
So kind of
And
mixed.
yeah, same thing, like same exact, like that's how it always would happen for me. It's like, well, once I start losing sleep and then the mind races, then it's like total chaos, right? And so, but the third time around was way worse than those previous two.
Yeah.
And I think partly because I did see a doctor a couple months before the episode happened, and she was like, hey, you should get back on this medicine. And
Mhm.
I said nah, I think I'm fine. And she warned me. She was totally right. She said you're probably going to have an episode again if
Yeah.
you don't do what I say.
Yeah.
And I
And
was
you're
like,
like, oh, and how did that? So when you have an episode, describe to me, because in
yeah,
case someone's listening that doesn't
sure.
understand it all, like what happens in your body? What happens in things you start doing in your life that you might not, averagely do when you're stable? Tell me about
Yeah,
that.
good question. Yeah. Well, an episode would just be defined. What my way of saying it would be kind of like if you're, an alcoholic. It's like a
Mhm.
relapse where
Mm.
you're getting just drunk, and your drunkenness is just getting so out of control
Mm.
that like you can't function, like you can't
Mhm.
work, or you just everybody's like, where have you been? And so with the mental, it's hard because people don't see everything. They don't see that your mind's racing. They don't see that you have suicidal thoughts. But for me, it was always it's like losing sleep and then entering into kind of this feeling of like I'm not in control of myself. So like
Okay.
whatever my mind wants to do, I gotta
Yeah.
fight really hard to like
Yeah.
not
So
give
you're
in and
like
do.
impulsive and it feels like, tell me if I'm wrong, it feels like I almost feel like not a machine, but I feel like it's gonna be worse if I don't do the thing, right? Like
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
trying to feel better, so you just do the next thing that feels.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
it's really hard to control yourself,
yeah,
and that's really scary. Like when you're in
yeah,
that state, you're like, it
and
really is a
yeah,
lot of suffering because you're like, and then the suicidal thoughts, the third time around was I don't it was like 1,000 times stronger than it was
yeah,
than those other times. So I was like, no, I really want to die, and I got to that place really, really quick. Um,
wow. Did you
so I
tell anyone that you were feeling that way or?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, I was living with people. I was living with roommates. My oldest nephew had just been born. My mom flew out to Kansas City to be with me, and I actually went to the hospital for the first time. So I went to a psych hospital there for about 7 days, and I
Did
remember
your mom take you or were you?
yeah, my mom took me, yeah, and all my roommates came to see me, and
Yeah,
initially I wanted to leave after the first like hour of being it was like a Friday, so they're like, oh well, you got to see the doctor and he might not be until Monday. That's like how lots of hospitals are, where if you come
yeah,
in on the weekend you got to wait, and people are like, when can I get out of here,
yeah,
and obviously I voluntarily checked myself in. So
yeah,
um I remember just being there for and hearing people's stories, and like people were talking about like their like addictions and like crazy stuff they were doing. People are smoking, and I was just like, this is not for me. I shouldn't be in here, But it ended up actually being okay. I did end up sleeping. I got a little bit stabilized,
mhm.
and this would have been about 2 weeks of not sleep. But then, anyway, it ended up being an 8-month episode. So the beginning of it was
Wow,
November
yeah,
2012, and I went to the hospital twice in Kansas City. Then I moved back to California like for good, and it was just me and my mom. And yeah, this was the hardest, worst time of life like that I had ever experienced. I was only 27, so it was like, but yeah, the reason why it was so hard, I think, was because of the getting off the meds. It was just not going to be an easy thing if it had been different. And because it was like when I looked back at those previous times, I think, when it happened the second time around, I got put on a bunch of stuff, and I stabled out pretty fast. It was like, oh, that was a rough 2 weeks, but this was like every single day felt like such hopelessness. And I know people are listening and they hear that, and it's like they don't want to get more discouraged than that. But it was hard because, like, as much as I loved my mom, there's only so much she could do, for me, and it really wore her out. So I did have a couple of suicide attempts in this time, and that had been something I had never done before either, where I actually was like, I went and I tried to. So I was in and out of the hospital, and then long story short, it was about May, so about at the 8-month mark. My mom had gone back to work. She's a flight attendant. She took a lot of time off from me. She was a little bit worried about leaving me alone. But I tried to overdose myself. I knew she was coming home, so it was like, it wasn't, if would have done it 2 days before, then I probably would have been dead. But I tried to overdose, and I knew my mom was coming home like, at like 10 o'clock that night. And I did this at, 6.
You wanted it to end, but not. Subconsciously, you knew that it wouldn't be forever.
Yeah, and I don't always share this, but I do believe in God, right? I do believe that, like, God's in control here, right? Like, even though I felt out of control, there was obviously spiritual forces working against me. My body was in this chemical storm, right? That's how lots of people describe it. It's like a storm, and it's like, look, eventually, the storm is gonna stop. Like, it's gonna stop raining in the boat, like when you watch like The Perfect Storm or something, right? Like, eventually it's gonna stop, right? Even though you feel like you're gonna die. And I was just tired of, like, I was like, I'm never getting out of this. Like, this is just, but I felt this strong sensation that while I was trying to overdose, and I was cutting my wrist, and it was really, really bad. I knew that I was going to live. Like, something in me was like, this isn't going to work. But I pushed it pretty close to the edge. So, so, I ended up in a coma. I mean, the worst part of the story was really that my mom had to come home and, she thought I was dead, basically. That's the worst part of the story, is like, she had to go through all of that. She's the only person that saw me like that, so I ended up in a coma. And lots of people were praying. A lot of my friends from Kansas City actually flew out to see me. They knew me through kind of the ministry I'd been a part of in Kansas City. And so they had like this internship, and people prayed for me for like 4 straight hours. So from like 8 a.m. to noon on, I think this was the 3rd day. I came out of the coma like that afternoon. So like I found that out later. They're like, oh, we prayed for you from 8 to 12. And then it was like that afternoon, they're like, oh, he's waking up out of the coma, So I ended up later moving to Pomona and like being a part of that church and meeting all those people. But I was grateful to be alive. I saw my nephew was like 6 years old at the time, and I saw my friends, and then they're like, oh, your friends from Kansas City are here. My buddy Zach flew from New York to LA because he was a pastor in New York at the time. And but it's interesting because like I still was not doing great when I woke up. Like, I was kind of grateful to be alive, but I was also still just messed up,
because it's our brains, right? I just want to back up for a second, because something kind of struck me, and I know your heart. And I know you said that you believe that God's in control, but one of the thoughts that I've had before, and I just want to make sure that our listeners, if they're thinking that at all, that they know that it's I don't think that God gave us the illness. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it's not like I want you to suffer, right?
Right.
I, I,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
very careful with that, only because it was something I thought, because of the stigma and thinking that it was so wrong. I was like, I've done something wrong and this is my punishment. So I just wanted to be clear that when
Yeah.
you say that, that is not, we don't want anyone to feel like this, things happen, and I believe too in God and in plans, but I don't think that always the terrible things that happen are something he's like put against, like put on
Yeah,
us.
for sure. Well, yeah, I'll comment on that too, because
Yeah,
I don't want to gloss over that. Like, God is in control. I mean, I think being a Christian and being raised in church, and whatever the 6 years I had of struggling up until this
yeah,
point, there was a lot of just like, wow, it feels like my faith is actually really working against me, kind of like the fact
yeah,
that I'm trying to be like, where is God in this? And isn't God good? And doesn't Jesus heal, every disease? And if this is a disease of the mind, like, why am I going through all of this? Right. And so I do think a lot of people, if you're listening and you're a faith person, it almost can feel like it's like working against you, that you're trying to kind of be like, where is God in all of this? So when I look back, I'm like, oh yeah, well, God was there the whole time, but obviously I went through a so much like pain and suffering, and I'm like, well, why was all of that? And yeah, I think I did blame myself for most of it. I
right.
was like, well, it was my choice to get off medication, so like, this is my fault, and that was not a good thought to have. um Even if it was somewhat true, it was like,
Yeah,
hey, take responsibility for your life, like, even if some of this is not on you.
yeah,
But later I had to work that out, right? Like,
yeah,
oh, okay, that was a mistake that I
yeah.
chose to.
Yeah.
um,
And
so
you
that's,
were
yeah.
just trying to to feel better, right? And if I find that, yeah, some of the things that I do that I, have regrets about, or sometimes I get like intrusive obsessive thoughts like, why would you do that? Or that kind of thing. I have to
Right.
remind myself that, we're all just trying to feel better, right?
Yeah.
And same with I've read about how um much more susceptible we are to addiction or things like that. It's because you want the pain to stop, or you want to like uh, even the side effect not to have the side effects, like you're trying to feel better. So I hope our listeners and our other bipolar warriors know, like, please don't get stuck in that, in the guilt or shame of it, because yes, you need to make better choices, but sometimes that just seems impossible. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, that's even more important to reach out and to get help. But if you sit in that, it's all my fault, it's going to be really hard to get on a healing journey. Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for pausing and talking about that. And I had to like work that stuff out as I
yeah,
started getting. But yeah, anyway, long story short, I spent 5 months in the hospital after that. So I coma, woke up, survived, and then I got some really good help with some good doctors. I started sleeping again, and yeah, after about a month of kind of trying some different medications, I started feeling like I was myself. So I actually had a pretty enjoyable 4 month hospital stay. And I
yeah,
think one time you were sharing about how you went to the hospital and you were like, I brought stuff to do, and I was
yeah. Well,
doodling.
it
Bring.
wasn't
I was like, I read so many books because my mind was just
yeah,
clear, and I remember reading like East of Eden, which is this like Steinbeck novel. It's like
yeah,
600 pages. I was like, I've never read a novel this big in my life, and
yeah,
I just devoured it. And I became best friends with the nurses, and lots of funny stories, lots of seeing me. You just get humbled by the people you meet, and you're like,
yeah.
oh wow, my life is really good.
Yeah.
Like,
And two, it's like, if you're there, or if you're someone that's just doing horribly, yeah, just sometimes I think it's easy to be like, I find that I try and not identify with, I used to not use the word bipolar because I had this image as well, right, of what the hospital was. Mine was a short stay treatment center to come off of medicine. So it wasn't the hospital, and you could leave whenever you wanted, but I wanted to
Right.
stay because I didn't want to come off my meds. And because my girls were little and I didn't want, in case I acted erratic or in case I got really sick, I didn't want them to see that. But I think, like, I don't know about you, but I found myself in every person there. I could find something. Do you know what I mean? Like something um, there. And it was so easy for me to be like, this is crazy. I'm kind of not, or whatever. I don't know. I think that it's given me such a compassion for all, a whole different set of people that I wouldn't have really maybe seen them before and seen their struggle. And I like that you talk a little bit about, the good parts of it, because I think there's some people listening right now that might need to go to the hospital, right?
Yeah.
And I love that you shared that there were good parts and that you did get better. And it sounds like, tell me if I'm wrong, that it really did save and help you.
Yeah, and the other thing too is I went to two different facilities. So the first hospital was 2 months, and it wasn't
Yeah.
completely normal that I did that because
Yeah.
um, I just ended up in this place. It was actually right by Disneyland in Anaheim, so I saw the
Oh,
Disneyland
wow.
fireworks every night at 9:30. They let us go outside, and
Watch
and
the
and, and
fireworks.
yeah,
That must have been bizarre, right? These
it's funny. You
two.
could hear him if you were in your room. You could hear it. Like that's how
Wow.
close we were. Yeah. Actually, there's a funny story. So I made friends with this guy. He was like a military guy, and so he gets discharged. And um, I guess right next to the not all psych places have an outside area where like
Right.
at this time smoking was still allowed. So we would do like smoke breaks a day. So I would sell my cigarettes to people because I didn't smoke.
Yeah.
So I'd sell my cigarettes for like quarters to like make phone calls, like
Fair enough.
Shawshank Redemption style, right? No, but there was this guy. He gets discharged, and I guess right next to the outside area is like a McDonald's and like a Subway and stuff. So he gets discharged. He goes through the drive-through and orders like I don't know 6 or 7 like cheeseburgers, and
Yeah.
he throws it over the fence, like perfect throw. And he like yells my name, and we happen to be outside. So he's like,
Yeah.
"Hey, Jared!" This bag of McDonald's just perfectly like makes it over the fence and like lands on the ground like right by us. So this guy Jason, who was became like my favorite nurse there, he was super cool. He was like, "Well, if it made it over the fence," he's like, "I guess you can eat it." So like we're all just chowing down on, not that the hospital food was so bad, it was decent, but you're like that kind
Yeah.
of thing is like, oh,
Outside
that's
world.
cool. Right, right. You're craving like, oh, can somebody throw Starbucks over the fence? Like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was a little bit
That's
harder.
pretty good. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and so I was gonna say the reason why there was it's funny because it's like you really only have two options. It's like you either become friends with people because you're all suffering. It's like, well, what else are we gonna do? Like I did read a lot and I journaled a lot, and then I just we watched a lot of movies. We watched hockey, and I was like, either I try to just like connect with people in here,
Yeah.
or I just like keep to myself and continue to like suffer by myself. And I think if you every hospital stay I've ever been in, I become friends with all the people
Yeah.
because you're just like it's like going to camp or something, right? Like
Yeah.
you have all this time. So and I know that's not an easy thing to get your head around. Like I've been in the hospital plenty of times where I'm like struggling so much, like even talking to people is like hard.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did start to get better, and so gratefully then I went to another facility where they let us go out for lunch, and then my mom like took me out on the weekends. So it got kind of similar to the place you were at. It was a little
Yeah.
bit more like we got to play basketball every day, and like it was a little bit better than like you're locked in here and you can't leave.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I was very blessed that I think because I was starting to get healthier.
Yeah. It was safer for you to go out.
Yeah, it was
It's
a little
not
bit more
mean
bearable.
that they're trying to lock you away. It's that you need to be so focused on one thing and they're trying to stabilize you, right? Yeah.
Yes. So lots of gratitude. And I still actually talk to some of the people that were workers at one of the places.
I
Like
love that.
we're like Instagram friends.
I
And
love it.
one of the ladies, she lost a child a few years ago, and I went to the funeral and I was like, I haven't seen you guys since 2013. And this was like 3 years ago. So it's amazing. I'm like, you guys are still like my friends, and they're like, we still talk about, how good of a patient you were. You were like
Oh,
one of
I
the
love
best at this
that.
place. And I'm just like, I
Well,
should have you on the podcast.
yeah. Well, don't you find that I truly believe whether you're an introvert or an extrovert or where you're at, I know it's really hard and it might take time, but I feel like we can't really heal without community. There's different support groups, there's Facebook groups or whatever. I've found the most healing aspect to me or feeling most understood is when I hang out with other people that are struggling. Because sometimes, even though I do have friends that, don't have mental illness, but there's something about coming together when you're in a healthy place, because sometimes you can make each other sick, right? But in a healthy place, I feel like I can just breathe, right? Like I hang out with you. The podcast, we started out like we want to help people, but really it's helped me so much. And it sounds like community really, really helps you.
Yeah, for sure. And I always get asked that when I work with NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness. We have In Our Own Voice and Ending the Silence. They're basically just like educational presentations, and we get to share like our personal experiences. And the best part is always the question and answer, right? The interaction with parents or students. And I've been in schools, and it's everyone's like, oh, why are you doing so great now? Or, how are you not like back where you were before? And I'm always like, well, it's more than just one thing, right? It's like, okay, it's the medicine part, it's the psychiatrist part. Therapy I avoided for years, but really, more recently I've been like, yeah, I need to be doing therapy more than I had before, right? So that's important. But then I'm like, it's not just, I think it's definitely community, and it's kind of, for me, like, it's not, most of the people that I'm really close to don't have similar struggles.
Okay.
They don't actually. It's not like they're like, oh, I understand taking medicine. Like, most of them are not. I'm not saying they don't struggle with stuff.
Yeah, but not the
So for
specific
me, it's kind of both. It's like, yeah, I do want to be around people. And I think the podcast for me is like same thing. I connect with people who struggle. I'm like, oh, that's cool, and then, people I do presentation, but it's not just being around people have similar stories, but it's just the power of like just having friends. It's just such a need that we have as people. It's like more than, food and water. It's like connection.
connection. And
So
belonging,
we can
right?
talk about that forever, but that's a huge part of all of this. So I totally love that you brought that up. And so for me, it's both. It's like, I do need to be around. Yeah. So it's both, but it's like, man, I just need people, or else I'm gonna isolate and just kind of make up all of these lies about like, nah, people don't really care, people, and it's still kind of hard sometimes. Like I go to my church small group, and you know how many times I've just been like, hey guys, I think I just need you guys to pray for me. Like, I don't even know what to do. I'm struggling. I mean, I have a doctor. I have these things I've built to keep me safe. But I'm like, man, I just need prayer. And it's like kind of hard to still do that, even though I don't regret it. When I leave, I go, well, at least I told people what was going on.
And like, I think that's important. You just touched on something. A couple of my friends, we see each other regularly, but we also have a WhatsApp group. And I know that when I'm struggling or having a thought, an unhealthy thought, or even a thought that I know that's not true, even just writing it in the WhatsApp group and them sending, even like a heart, or we usually send like, gifts or GIFs. I'm older, so I don't know the right way to say it. That he knows. Thank you.
Memes.
So, but I find the power, it's so simple, but the power of saying it aloud. And you know what? there is stigma, and there are, you know, if you're someone that doesn't have friends or a community, that, you know, keep trying. And I think that's where maybe starting in a group helps, like online, because it's, if like, because if you don't have a support system, it's like, it's hard to make friends when we're older, right? If you're not, like, say if you're someone that isn't a part of a church, they're, you know, um yeah, I think just keep trying till you find a safe person. And also I find that I used to be so hesitant to give people a chance. And sometimes, you know, we don't give people the chance to show up for us.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not to oversimplify things, but it's like, what's the first thing to do when you're struggling? And it's like, ask for help. I mean, it kind of comes down to that, because out of that is all this other
Yeah.
all this other opportunity. So it's like, wow, you can't, it's like if you go to a doctor and they're like, well, tell us, you got to fill out the forms, like, what's your medical history? You're like, oh, this is annoying. Why do I gotta go back and tell you, what disease my dad had,
Yeah.
and they're like, well, I gotta try to help you. I need some information,
Yeah.
and it's like, or you take your car to get fixed and you're like, well, I don't want you to look at my car. I just want you to fix it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like,
Well, yeah.
you gotta open up, and that's what's really hard for all of us. I know people can live different places, but it's like, you're not in control of how people are going to respond. And yeah, you can tell the wrong person, right? You can say
Yeah.
it to a not safe person, and so you want to tell the right people.
Yeah.
But like you're saying, it's like this kind of mystery of the universe of like having faith and having courage is, you got to kind of take that that step of, it's like that Indiana Jones movie where he steps, like,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and the step shows up only when he like takes the risk, right? And like puts his foot down. It's like, it's exactly what it's like. It's like, the only way to go forward is go like, man, I got to humble myself and say, it's not an issue of intelligence. It's just like, I don't know what to do.
One thing I wanted to touch on, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, but how do you find it, being open as a man? Um,
Mhm.
like, do you find, like you were saying, you find more women to go on your podcast? Like, do you find that there's more stigma maybe, and that less people talk about it? What's your experience or thoughts on men and openness about mental health and shame and all of those things?
Yeah, well, first of all, yes, I have had mostly women on my podcast, but I do think there is a lot of progress that's been made with men. I actually just did a podcast about a month ago with a friend, and we did like a special like men
Cool.
night, and it was really good. So I do think lots of people are stepping up. And yeah, it is harder for men, I think, because of just the conditioning of culture to just, we don't talk about how we feel, or
Yeah.
even if you feel sensitive or tender, that kind of is like, nah, I shouldn't like really show people that, you're like, why am I writing poetry? Shouldn't I be out like chopping wood, or like, like, or whatever cliche, like, shouldn't I be out? I mean,
So
look,
funny, right?
I grew up playing ice hockey, which was a very violent sport, and I played
Yeah.
football and lacrosse, and so. But then on the other hand, I'm like, I cry when I watch like romantic comedies, or just like, like, are other people crying at this part of the movie, and
And you
so.
can guarantee that they are. They just might not be talking about it,
Yeah,
right?
and there's always a balance, because it's like, look, I don't go hunt and try to like kill animals, and I don't even necessarily like camping, even though like, or whatever. But um yeah, I think it's just, what helps me more, I think, is just be like, I gotta just try to be myself,
Yeah.
and it's like, and there's been lots of I think self-hatred, honestly, around the sensitive thing. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I don't really like that I'm like this, like, and you would think like, oh, don't women, isn't that what women want, like, in a man, that is someone who's like open and vulnerable and honest. You're like, sure, maybe they want to.
Hopefully we want that in each
Well,
other,
right,
right?
and not to assume that I
Yeah.
know what women want, but I'm just saying that, like, in any serious relationship that you have with the female, there's always this, like, well, tell me how you feel, and they're like, I don't know. I mean, let's just go do stuff, whatever. It's like, so I think that it's a challenge, and it's gotten a little bit easier over time of
Yeah.
just like, oh, I have been having this conversation for years. I've been talking about this with everyone in
Yeah.
public settings,
Before
at
people were really
church,
talking about it.
at work. Yeah, it comes, and so yeah, men we do need to come out of hiding and, like,
Yeah.
keep having these conversations for sure. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. I think it's just kind of
Yeah.
similar to what we've been talking about. It's like, oh, there's always a risk involved, right? Of just like,
Yeah.
what if I share too much? But then um also at the same time, that's the kind of the thing that people then kind of are appreciative of, for you, like, oh wow, thank you for being like a vulnerable
Yeah.
um male, of like, and I didn't have the best example of that with my dad. My dad was not open about his life at all. He kind of ran away from himself, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't have kids, but I'd like to have kids someday, and I love being around my nephews, and it's like, I want to be a good example for them. And they
Yeah.
have a great dad too. My brother-in-law is amazing, and I'm like, I'm not my dad, I'm not passing on what he passed on to me, so it's not easy, like all of this stuff. It's all kind of a
Yeah.
challenge, but
Yeah.
I don't want to go to sleep at night and go, oh yeah, I just, when people ask me a question, I just, lied, or I just kind of, didn't open up. Like, I don't want that feeling at the end of each day of like, oh, how are all of my conversations with people? Like, how did was I humble about it? Was I real? And no, sometimes the like be yourself thing can be a little overdone. It's like, no, in certain settings you don't need to like tell people your whole story. Like,
Yeah.
hey, I was suicidal once. Do you want to hear my
Yeah.
story?
Yeah.
But if it comes up and people say whatever, it's like, hopefully in those moments I can be like, hey, I've kind of struggled with that too, and they're like, oh wow, you're a stranger. Why are you telling me that? So people, I think, will compliment you for being vulnerable, and I think that's what we need to do more of, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And I could talk about that forever. And I just want to commend you because
Thank you.
you're doing good work in the world, and your vulnerability and you being here and just the way you show up in the world, you're giving everyone permission to just show up and not just be their authentic self, right? And I just think that that's just a really beautiful thing, and I'm really glad to know you. I because I've mostly interviewed women, I'm just so excited to know someone else that's doing the work.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just want to thank you so much for that. And before we go, I wanted to ask you a question because I know you've suffered greatly,
Uh,
and you talk about being a suicide survivor, and I just wonder, um, maybe you're having suicidal ideation as a listener, or maybe you're just really struggling. I'm just wondering, what would you say to that person?
that's a great question, and what's also kind of interesting is that's what I always ask people in my podcast at the end. I say that same question. I
Okay,
say, what do you say? So I'm like, oh, I got to answer my own question now.
I love
Uh, well, um, nothing's permanent. I think that probably a couple of things. The first thing is that, like, you can't stay in the same place forever. Um,
it.
and we are very much led by how we feel more than what we
Mm,
know, right? Like, we can know, oh, it's going to get better, but we don't feel that. We
right.
don't feel hope. Someone's like, oh, what gives you hope? And I think that's a part of what the question you have to ask yourself too, is like, what gives you hope in this moment? And I know when I was suicidal, I was trying to think about my family, like, more than anything. I was like, oh man, my sister has 3 boys now. At the time, she just had one, right? And I was like, oh wow, what about, like, what if my nephew, like, just grew up and all he knew was like a picture of me, you
Yeah.
know. So you have people in your life that need you and love you. I mean, even if it's one person, you know, like you would be greatly missed if you weren't
Yeah.
around, you know. And I know that's hard. It's hard to get your head around some of that stuff because it feels like maybe you feel even more guilty that you're thinking about yourself more than you're thinking about other people. And you know, it's like when people say like, oh, a suicide is so selfish or whatever, and it's like that's such a bad thing to tell a
Oh, it's
person.
horrible.
You're the self is involved and you probably are thinking about yourself too much. That's probably true, which everybody is.
Yeah.
But yeah, try to remember that like you can't be in the same place forever. I mean, even if you tried really hard to be like, I'm gonna be stuck here forever, you can't. It's like you will eventually get out of it. And it's really hard to take things moment by moment. It's hard to be like,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make it through the day, like that survival mode of like it feels like everything is working against you, like time is a curse, you know, of like just. And yeah, try to um you know, ask for help, like
Yeah.
as just a little bit more each day, like little goals for yourself, like, hey, I'm just gonna just open up with this person. And I think if you can find that connection, I know I had so many conversations when I was suicidal. I probably called my sister like every day
Yeah.
and she just took the time to talk to me, even though I was like, you know, she was a new mom at the time. And she just every day, and a lot of times she said the same stuff like over and over again, like,
Yeah.
and it helped a lot. And yeah, I think it's kind of that like man's search for meaning kind of thing, that the book, you know, Viktor Frankl, of like, you know, in horrible situations, I mean, people still can find, they can hold on to something, right? Like they can find something. um you know, we're a lot stronger than we think, you
Yeah.
know. And I think
Well, that's
people who,
good.
well, yeah, people who go through this stuff are some of the strongest out there, you know.
I
And you don't
agree.
really know until it happens, right? You're
Of
like, I
course.
didn't realize I was strong until I wasn't sleeping or I was whatever. And it's like, you will look back at this and it will be like a turning point kind of thing of like, wow, that's what I really started to like work on myself, you know, or whatever. And I experienced that when I had 5 months of just being like, man, I better start asking for help or else I'm just gonna like keep coming back to this hospital. Like I'm gonna be like the people in here who are refusing to get help and they just keep coming in and out of this place, you know. And um so
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love how you said the moment by moment, because sometimes the future, like it seems so
yeah,
far away and so hard, just moment by moment and just searching for the light. Like you said, hope. There's always, even if it's the tiniest thing, like the cozy blanket, or,
right,
that you have someone to call, focusing on gratitude. And sometimes I tell people that just say, Shayla, I don't have any hope. I say, find someone to hope for you. Like you said, your sister said the same thing, and it took a long time for that to sink in. And I just think, yeah, just keep searching for the light. And again,
yeah,
I thank you so much. We will put all Jared's info in the notes, and I just hope that you follow him and encourage him, and
thanks guys.
go and listen to all the things and read his poetry. That's what I'm gonna do.
Yeah, all right, I'll send you a link. Yeah, I was gonna one quick other thing is like to just try to have compassion on yourself. Like that's a hard
Yes.
one because I know for me I've been hard on myself like
Yes.
before I had these symptoms, right? And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh man, I'm still like, you know, I'm kind of like, I'm still like this. You know, I
Yeah.
still get just down and I'm like, you know, wow, why I have such high standards of myself, you know. And some of it's from wanting to live with excellence or do a good job, which those aren't bad things. But um man, loving yourself is really important. So
Yes.
try it. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation.
No, I love that. That's a perfect way to end. Have compassion for yourself.
For sure.
And as hard as it is, love yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you
Awesome.
so much for having me.
Yes.
You're amazing. I love this, and hope we can do it again sometime.
Yes, I love that. I love that. Well, this is bipolar.